What if the absolute worst moments of our lives weren't just meaningless static? What if somehow profound suffering could actually have a divine purpose? It's a huge, tough paradox, and today we're going to unpack one very specific and pretty challenging answer to it. This line from the 18th century poet William Cowper just perfectly captures the mystery we're looking at. A frowning providence. Yeah, that's the pain, the loss, the confusion that we all run into. But behind all that, Cowper suggests there's a smiling face. Now, this isn't about just ignoring the pain, it's about searching for something hidden right inside of it. So let's just ask it straight up. Can suffering really have a purpose? I mean, is it possible that the worst things that happen to us aren't just random tragic events, but are actually part of some larger, meaningful design? This is the huge question at the heart of a book by theologian John Piper. And his perspective is, well, it's powerful. In his book, The Hidden Smile of God, Piper doesn't just argue this with a bunch of abstract theory. Nope. Instead, he builds his entire case on the real, lived experiences of three men who went through almost unimaginable hardship. And really, their stories are the backbone of this whole idea. And that's exactly where we're headed next. The book calls these guys suffering swans, which is a nod to an old phrase about saints who could sing even as they were facing death. We're going to look at who they were and the incredible misery they each had to face. So Piper's whole argument is grounded in the lives of these three men: John Bunyan, the writer; William Cowper, the very poet we just quoted; and David Brainerd, who was a missionary. And the one thing that connects them all is that each of their lives was just absolutely marked by a deep, relentless kind of suffering. Okay, check out this slide because the contrast here is just staggering. Look at these columns. On one side, you've got devastating affliction. I mean, John Bunyan spent 12 years in prison, away from his wife and kids, including a young blind daughter he adored. William Cowper was crippled by a severe, lifelong depression. It led to multiple suicide attempts. And David Brainerd, he died at just 29 from tuberculosis while working in absolutely brutal conditions. But then you look at the other side. Out of that exact same suffering came world-changing fruit, one of the most famous books ever written, hymns we still sing today, and diaries that literally inspired a global missionary movement. So, that brings us right to the heart of it. How is that possible? How could a damp prison cell, a mind tormented by despair, and a body racked with a fatal illness produce legacies of such incredible light and hope? Well, according to the book, this wasn't an accident at all. It was by design. And to answer that question, the book lays out a very specific theological framework. The argument is, to really get the fruit of their affliction, you first have to understand the nature of the God who, in this view, is overseeing the whole thing. The big idea here is what theologians call God's sovereignty. As Piper lays it out, this basically means God isn't just some passive observer, just reacting to things as they happen. No, the idea is that he actively governs everything that happens, the good and the bad, with a specific, wise, and ultimately good purpose for those who love him. Nothing, not even the worst kind of suffering, is outside of his purposeful control. Now look, this is a really challenging idea, and the book puts it right up against other views. On the left, you see the book's perspective. It's summed up perfectly by that quote from the Bible where Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, says to them, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Notice those two active verbs. You meant evil, God meant good. The point is that God doesn't just clean up our messes. He purposefully weaves even the evil intentions of people into his good plan. Then, on the right, you see a view the book opposes, the idea that some suffering is just pointless, a tragedy with no divine purpose. The book argues that this view just doesn't hold up. And this whole mindset is captured again in another line from William Cowper's hymn. For him, this belief that God had bright designs hidden in his suffering wasn't some cold academic doctrine. It was his lifeline. It was the very source of hope that let him believe his pain wasn't just pointless, even when his own mind was screaming that it was. Okay, so if a belief in God's sovereign purpose was the what that kept them going, the next question is, how? What was the spiritual tool, the specific belief that allowed them to hold on to that hope when things got so dark? The book points to one core doctrine. And that doctrine is justification by faith. Let's break that down because it can sound complicated. All it really means is the belief that your standing with God isn't based on your own goodness or how well you perform or even how you feel emotionally. Instead, it's based entirely on trusting in the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ, which is then credited to your account. For these three guys, who were painfully aware of their own flaws and emotional turmoil, this was Well, this was everything. And this is the emotional heart of the whole thing. This quote from John Bunyan is him describing his big breakthrough. He was just tormented by feelings of guilt, sure he was doomed. And then this thought hit him, "Thy righteousness is in heaven." He suddenly realized his right standing with God wasn't inside of him, dependent on his shaky feelings or his flawed character. It was secure, outside of himself, in Christ. And in that one moment, he says, "Now did my chains fall off my legs indeed." Just profound liberation.
And the book argues this was the shared secret for all three of them. Bunyan, the Baptist, Cowper, the Anglican, and Brainerd, the Congregationalist, from different traditions, but they all found their anchor in this exact same truth. It freed them from that impossible burden of having to be good enough or feel good enough. Their righteousness was secure, which meant they could endure prison, depression, and disease without having their ultimate hope completely shattered.
So let's bring this all together now. We started with this paradox of suffering producing good fruit. We've looked at the theological framework the book uses to explain it, this idea of God's sovereign design, and the spiritual anchor that made it all bearable, justification by faith. So now, let's look at the final harvest.
The book calls the results both ironic and disproportionate, and you can totally see why. John Bunyan's physical confinement produced The Pilgrim's Progress, maybe the greatest story ever written about spiritual freedom. William Cowper's intense mental anguish produced hymns that have brought deep comfort and clarity to millions. And David Brainerd's lonely, isolated suffering out in the wilderness, documented in his diary, just exploded after he died into a global movement, inspiring countless people. The fruit wasn't just in spite of the suffering, the book argues it grew directly because of it. And maybe John Bunyan himself gives us the perfect metaphor for this entire idea. He observed that in some parts of the world, trees can grow, but they won't bear any fruit because they never experience the hardship of winter. For Bunyan, and for the argument of this book, affliction is that necessary winter. It's the harsh season that by God's design forces our roots to go deeper and in the end produces the most lasting fruit.
And that leaves us with one final pretty provocative thought. The stories of these three men, as this book tells them, they really challenge us to look at our own lives in a different way. They force us to ask, what if the frowning providence in our own lives, our struggles, our setbacks, our pain, what if it isn't just something to get through, but is actually the very soil from which God is planning to grow our most meaningful and lasting legacy?